to visit with you, kind of had a charge today to come in and visit with you about the sequester, about the budget process, and spend kind of a fair amount of time focused on that issue. So I'm really not going to talk to you about crop outlook and where we think the markets are headed and all that kind of good stuff. We could do that if you want to do, but I really want to spend some time talking more about what's going on the budget front. I'm really going to only have about 2 slides or so back here to talk about the Farm Bill. One of the things that I will tell you that I gave a presentation about 3 weeks or so ago up in Wyoming. When I had that presentation set up, they teach you in extension, and I did a fair number of years in extension here in the state. They teach you to tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So I had my 3 bullet points up that did just that, and it was I don't know, and I don't know. So we can make some educated guesses about where we think the Farm Bill process is headed, but at the end of the day, I don't think any of us know. I think last year was kind of a classic example of, you kind of know what's supposed to happen, but that sure ain't what happened. And I think we're in very much that same kind of situation today. So let me back up so we're going to talk about how we got here. The kind of sequester fear. We're going to talk a lot about the sequester, how it gets implemented, what it means, what happens under that process, and just spend some time on that front. I want to spend a little time kind of really talking to you about what our real budget problem is at this stage of the game. Because we are by no means going to resolve this issue over the course of the next 3 or 4 weeks. This problem is going to be with us for a long time. And let's just resolve ourselves to that and kind of move forward from there. And as I say, we'll talk a little bit about the Farm Bill as well. I'm going to go through, and I pulled some slides here, and I will tell you that I have blatantly plagiarized these slides from the Bipartisan Policy Center. If this group, if you look at kind of the big names that are around it, you got to have big names around it, otherwise, it's just a bunch of little names. So the big names around it, a guy by the name of Pete Domenici. How many of you remember Pete Domenici, who used to be chairman ranking member of the Senate Budget Committee? Just a great guy. He's been in the news here recently, and maybe not quite as pleasantly as you'd like him to be, but just when it comes to his knowledge of the process and the budget and recognition of the problems, et cetera, just a really great guy. Alex Rivlin, former head of CBO as well. Both of those are associated with the Bipartisan Policy Center. And there's, I don't know, 4 or 5 other senators around as well that are part of that group. And this is by no means the only group that's out there focused on the budget and deficit problems. Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. I mean, there's a slug of these folks around out there at this stage of the game. Maybe one of these days we'll start listening to them. So, how did we get here? How did we get this kind of sequester issue? If you remember back 2 or 3 years ago when we kind of went through that first debt ceiling problem the Obama administration faced and the crisis that arose from that. And actually a book got written about it that Bob Woodward wrote called The Price of Politics. And if you've not read that book, maybe you really don't want to, but because it's kind of one of the most depressing books you'll ever read. Because it goes on for literally about 200 pages. And on this side of the page, the Obama administration demands that we have tax increases on the wealthy. And on this side of the page, the Republicans demand entitlement reform. And you turn the page. Tax increases on the wealthy, entitlement reform. And you turn the page. Tax increases on the wealthy, and this goes on for literally 200 pages. And there's no connect between the two as you go through and this goes on for months, and we get right up to the edge, and we devalue our debt, and all, or our credit rating, all this stuff goes on, and it's like, would somebody just listen to the other guy for a minute and say, how do we get this thing solved? So as they went through this process and have no misperceptions about this whatsoever. It was Mr. Liu, the guy who's more than likely going to be Treasury Secretary, who put the proposal on the table that, look, we can't, in order to make teeth come together around this deal, Let's make a sequester be part of the process. And it was indeed both the Obama administration and the Republicans and Bader that said, okay, let's do it. And let's not just put a 1-year sequester in place, let's put a 10-year sequester in place. And if we don't hit this number, the sequester will kick in and it will be evenly, and we'll talk more about evenly divided and all that other kind of good stuff. So they passed the Budget Control Act. We actually passed a revision or an amendment to the Budget Control Act, a rewrite of the old Budget Control Act, and put that bill in place. And it set these rules out. And as a matter of fact, if you pull the Budget Control Act out and read through it, you need to get a life. But if you do pull it out and read through it, you will find that there are literally 7 pages of exemptions from a sequester. Some little programs, some big programs, you know, but there are literally 7 pages of exemptions from a sequester. Some things like Conservation Reserve Program contracts. That's a good thing to be on the list, right? You've signed a long-term contract, you're holding up your end of the bargain, you know, you've taken that land out of production, by gosh, they ought to honor that contract and they ought to write you a check. Current year crop insurance benefits are exempt from a sequester. That's a good thing. You wrote the check, you know, you paid your part of the bill. They ought to honor their part and they ought to pay their part. SNAP program, you know, the Supplemental Nutrition Program, food stamps, are exempt from a sequester. And it goes on, but then it goes on and on and on. I mean, it just goes on. So that's part of the Budget Control Act. The Budget Control Act also lays out some schedules, which we'll talk about a little bit more as we go through the conversation. But the Budget Control Act also set up, remember, it set up the super committee. And the super committee was supposed to go off and find $1.2 trillion in cuts over a 10-year period of time. And the super committee failed miserably. And I don't know why you thought they were going to succeed where, you know, nobody else could get it done before that, but anyway, be that as it may. And so here we are with the super committee failure. And we are now, even though we tried to delay it once, you know, when we put the fiscal cliff deal together, we tried to delay it. But now here we are, March 1, the sequester is going to kick into place. Oh my God, we're all going to die. So let's just talk through this a little bit. And let me come out here with you because I want you to be looking up at the screen as we go through this conversation. So I'll use this one over here, but okay, here's the overall number, $1.2 trillion sequester that was supposed to be in place for the fiscal year 2013 through 2021. And so that's his total number. I'll come over here just so you guys don't feel like you're being slighted. So the total number, and they gave themselves credit that, you know, if we cut money, then we're not going to have to pay interest on that debt, and so we're going to claim credit for that interest before we ever get started. So that's just $216 billion of assumed debt service savings you see over here. So they had to come up then with, not really 1.2, but actually really $984 billion, split evenly over those 9 years. So that's $109 billion a year. That's where this $110 billion number comes from, that you hear that's what the Democrats, for example, want to find in their package. Now out of that, we split that in half. So $492 billion came out of defense. And that's maybe a little bit of a misnomer. It's not just defense, it's basically all homeland security as part of that defense piece. And $492 billion out of non-defense. And out of that $492 billion, that basically comes out of discretionary funding. And discretionary funding, by the way, if you look at how we fund defense, you would think that that's kind of a mandatory spending number, that you got to spend it. Well, that's not true. Actually, defense spending is an appropriated annual number that we go off and do things on. It's not a mandatory spending. On the non-defense cuts, we get lower amounts of discretionary funding. Again, that's the annual budgeting process. That's the annual appropriation. There's a cap of no more than 2% reductions in Medicaid. And that 2% number we're going to come back and talk about a little bit more. We're going to see that show up again. Then we have, subsidy cuts, and then we've got other mandatory cuts of about $41 billion as well. So again, 50-50 split, defense, non-defense, 2% caps on Medicare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's also interesting to note that, okay, I'm not a guy who is in favor of boosting taxes at all. If you come back and look historically, we were actually at the lowest level of revenue going into the government. Proportion of GDP going to government coffers. We were down in the, actually well below the 16% range or so before we ended up moving over the cliff. Once we moved past the cliff, we did this little dip, ends up being about 1% or so increase in the percent of GDP going to federal revenues, coming in at about 19%, kind of well below, 1% below the GDP rate that we were when we actually talked about the balance. But I apologize for this, and I'm not going to show you this video. If you've not seen, I know that many of you have seen this video, that's why I decided not to show it to you again today. If you've not seen this video, it runs about 3 minutes. It's probably one of the most educational videos about the debt that you will ever go see, because it just drives it home. This guy goes into the bank and he says, I want to raise my debt limit, and the conversation kind of proceeds to take. I'll watch it. It's actually very, those of you who see it know it, and I think they're backing up on this. This is really funny. But it's, it's funny like, hey, this is us, So at the end of that video, they kind of go through, turning the federal debt into a householding debt. And so we talk about going, here's for 2013. The United States, for FY 2013, is going to bring in an expected $2.7 trillion. We're going to spend about $3.6 trillion. We're going to run a deficit of $872 billion. Our total debt at the end of FY 2013 is expected to be about $17 trillion. And out of this, in order to bring things into balance, we're going to cut our spending by $85 billion, $85.4 billion. Now let's just act like this with you as a family, and let's just drop off 8 zeros at the end of those numbers. So to put this in perspective, if you had a family revenue of about $27,000, you're spending $35,000 a year, so you're putting almost $9,000 a year on your credit card. Your credit card debt today runs $170,000 for a guy that's making $27,000. And he's going to cut his budget by a whopping $854 to bring himself into debt. And that's the number. All we've done is drop off the edge, but that's the number. Now, as I usually tell folks, you know what, this $854 that the whole family had to spend hours around the table trying to debate how they were going to make these cuts. What were they going to take out? You know what this $854 always ends up being, don't you? It's Dad saying he'll not go out to lunch every day. He'll actually take his lunch to work. That's always what that ends up being. I know, because that's how my family's argument always. So ordinarily I'd stand up in front of you and I'd say, and folks that have heard me do budget conversations before, that we basically spend all of the money that we take in on 5 things. We spend all the money we take in on defense, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the national debt. Well, as we talk through this sequester, it's going to be kind of important for us to look at this just a little bit different way. So here we are for the FY 2012 budget, for example. About 21% of our revenue, or of our budget went to Medicare, Medicaid. About 21% went to Social Security. We had about 19% went to defense discretionary spending. That's basically defense spending. And about 7% interest on the national debt. So we did not, basically we had to finance all of our non-defense discretionary spending as well as all of our other mandatory spending as well. That all got financed. That was all either you borrowed it, you bought a T-bill, China bought a T-bill, somebody bought a T-bill to finance that. So Fed bought a T-bill. The problem we faced And let's spend a little time on this line. I want you to notice here we are today, 2012, or we're right about there at the kink. Notice how this is debt to GDP ratio. Notice how here we are in 2012 or so, and it's going to flatten out and not really grow all that much between 2012 and 2022. I would say that we've got a window over the course of the next 10 years to kind of come in here and get a handle on this problem. Because by the time you get out to about 2022 or so, it starts to take off. It doesn't just take off, we actually hit 100% debt to GDP ratio by 2027, 200% by the time we'd be out to 2040, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Where did all that come from? Well, quite frankly, when we talk about, let's talk about this discretionary spending, both defense and non-defense. And that's where most of what you think of as government lies. That's where the FBI, that's where FSIS, meat inspectors. That's where TSA, Transportation Security Agency, that's where you get those intimate relationships with a complete total stranger. We come through Tampa. This was about 6-9 months or so ago. My wife and I come through Tampa. And she has a string of sequins on her blouse. Just one sequin long, she has blouse on there. Just coming down, and it does a little loop when it comes down. And because the machine could not see through it, they had to pat her down. And I'm like, guys, there's really, pretty much I've been the only guy that's touched those for, But so basically all of the rest of government, transportation, education, Pell Grants, on and all of the stuff, really, when it gets right down to it, that you think of as government, is in this green line right here. And I want you to notice what it's going to do from 2000. This is what we already agreed to. Remember back when we set up the super committee? Remember when we had that conversation about passing the Budget Control Act? Included in the Budget Control Act that has nothing to do with the sequester. What we've already agreed to do with discretionary spending. We've already said we're going to do this. Notice what this does from 2012 to 2022. We go from about, let's say, 8.5% or so of GDP going out on those discretionary spending accounts down to about 5.5%. So all that other stuff that we think of as government, improvements of lock and dams, all that stuff, we've already said we are committed to cutting that spending. And that's before sequester. We're going to talk about this a little bit more. We're going to actually put dollar amounts up here in just a second. All the other mandatory programs, this is going to be stuff like farm programs. It's also going to be stuff like food stamps. Notice what those are expected to do. We're going to go from a little under 4%, about 3.5% or so, down to 2% by 2022. It's already going down. Social Security. I'm going to retire about right there. Okay, it's going up a little bit, but it ain't going up by a lot. That's a very, a relatively controlled number. Here's healthcare spending. If you do not, and how many of you have heard me stand up in front of you before? If you do not get a handle on healthcare spending, just establish a budget for it. I don't care what the number is, just make it be a number. If you do not get a handle on healthcare spending, you will not solve the federal budget problem. So understand that on all these other things, we've pretty well got a handle on. It's this one, and because of this one, it's also this one. Now notice we're going to go from spending a little under 2% of GDP on our net interest cost, 2040, 10% of our GDP going to pay our net interest cost. You know, what do you do when you're just rolling the debt over? You're borrowing money to pay the interest. And that's what we're doing. We're borrowing money to pay the interest. And again, so it's this actually, when folks complain about medical care costs, yes, it is medical care costs, but it just compounds, this just compounds that problem that much more. This actually ends up being the fastest growing spending category if we don't get a handle on our spending relative to our revenue. Let's go back to those discretionary programs for just a minute. Because let's talk about what the sequester does. So here's what the old baseline used to be. This is go back before we had that whole debate about the raising the debt limit, establishing the big committee and all other kind of good stuff. That's what the expectations were on that discretionary spending category. Here's what the Budget Control Act caps will do or have done to that spending category. So notice, instead of spending in 2012, we were expecting to spend not quite $1.3 trillion. Now we're down to $1.2 trillion. And it's supposed to drop down to not quite $1.15 trillion in 2013. I had a conversation with somebody at breakfast about, real cuts need to be real reductions in spending. We're going to do real reductions in domestic discretionary spending, or discretionary spending, not just domestic discretionary, but discretionary spending in 2013 relative to what we did in 2012. We're actually going to be back down to 2008 levels if we stick to our guns and really do what it is that we said we were going to do. And so notice that, yes, it does come back up a little bit. You're going to say, oh, wait a second, over here, you had those as flat. Again, just remind yourselves, these are percent of GDP. So as GDP grows, it's still a constant percentage of GDP, and that's where you get this, slight uptick because of the general economy growth. Now you come in and slap sequester on top of that as well. And you pretty much are in a position where sequester, really only comes out of these pots. 2% on Medicare, remember? But other than that, it kind of all comes out of these pots. So notice that it dips down here pretty far, just a touch above $1 trillion on these discretionary spending amounts. That'll be a big deal if we get down there and actually stay down there. You'd actually talk about this number being back to this is actually back down to 2008 levels. This is above, but this is actually 2008 levels. Now remember, that sequester numbers that we put up before, those were 10-year numbers. Now we said, again, you do a sequester on an annual basis. You don't do it, boom, for 10 years. You do it every year. So how do we do this for this year? Well, we're going to get $85.3 billion in sequester, split evenly between defense spending and non-defense spending. On the defense side, again, it's basically all discretionary amounts. As you can see, there's very little mandatory money in defense accounts. So we're going to do $43 billion cut out of defense spending. We're going to do $26 billion in discretionary cuts. That was just, basically where the domestic side, where this chunk, the defense and the domestic discretionary is where that drop comes from. We're also going to talk about those 2% in Medicare cuts. And we're going to do other mandatory cuts of $5.1 billion. This is where direct spending or direct payments would come from, for example, for farm programs. Also where counter-cyclical payments, things of that nature, would end up under that tab. But if you go back and look at where these cuts relative to the size of the pot that they're going to come out of, on the mandatory side, again, it's little clear, $15 billion out of this $2.1 trillion of mandatory spending. We're going to talk about out of the $700 billion for defense discretionary account, we're going to take $43 billion out of that. Notice the size of that pot. That's a pretty good size of box compared to, say, what we're doing over here on the mandatory side. That's the relative size of those cuts out of defense spending. So are these guys going to feel it? Yeah, they're going to feel it. Domestic discretionary spending, $600 billion total amount. We're going to take about $26 billion out of that pot. Tax expenditures, this is accelerated depreciation, this is 179, this, you know, all that other stuff on the tax side. We don't touch any of that stuff. Now don't forget that, you know, we're going to start this in March. Henry, stand up here for me for just a second, will you? Hold your hand up like this for me. Okay. March, April, May, June, July, August, September, that's it. Okay. We're going to take all that money out of those 7 months. We don't have 12 months. We got 7 months. Okay, thanks. Thanks. So that's where the money's got to come from. We're going to take that, we're not taking this money out of all 12 months spending. We're down to 7 months. This would be like me coming to you and, you know, pick the month and say, you know, okay guys, I need so much more money for chemicals out of this crop. You know? So let's just kind of work through that. If this was an annual cut on the non-defense discretionary side, you know, there'd be about a 5% cut. And if I came to you and said you got to cut things by 5% over the year, you know, okay, we can do some things. Now we're talking about roughly 8% of the months that we got left. Look at these defense guys. 13% wax. As I say, they're going to feel this. They're going to know this happens. So when we talk about we're going to have to furlough defense employees, we're going to have to furlough defense civilian folks, etc. Yeah, probably so. Because, you know, there's just so much, you can't say to the guy who you're renting the building from, sorry, not going to write you a check this month because it's a sequester. What do you suppose the guy who owns the building will do to you tomorrow? Well, he might, but, you know, you get the picture. Well, that's a good ringtone. When they tell you that we don't know, that, you know, there's not a lot of knowledge about the sequester, you know, you know, that's kind of bull. We know in great detail what the total amount of money is going to be. Here's a couple that, and you can go out on the OMB's website, on the White House website, you can pull these down. This happens to be FSIS, I just pulled a couple. And you'll notice that their total budget is just a little bit over $1 billion, $1.049 billion. They're going to take an 8.2% hit, so they got to come up with $86 million over the next 7 months out of their $1 billion budget. Now you can get deeper now how they get that. That's a real question. You know, there are things that they can do to go get that money. For example, when they put their budget together this year, they figured out ways that they could, you know, yeah, they're supposed to be on a budget freeze, but, you know, hey, I've worked in bureaucracies before and been handed budget freezes, and you say to yourself, you know, guys, there's got to be some way I can do something to help my employees out this year. Particularly the really good ones. And you'll figure out ways to shuffle money here and shuffle money there, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, we're under a budget freeze, or under a salary freeze. But admittedly, in the, you know, kind of statement of managers from the FSIS administrator, he has said he's going to shuffle, at the beginning of the year, he said he was going to shuffle money around so that he could get his staff a 0.5% pay increase on average. Hey, as a manager, I would do everything I could to do that kind of stuff. That's why he's there. He's a manager. Manage. So do I know how he's going to manage that $87 million cut? No, not really. I will tell you that 25% of FSIS's budget gets spent in the Washington, D.C. office. How many inspectors do we have in the Washington, D.C. office? Plant inspectors in the Washington, D.C. office today? 0. So you tell me. I mean, do you have to shut plants down? Let me tell you another little secret. What do you, as a taxpayer, actually pay for when it comes to that plant inspector? You know? You know what you pay for, Blake? I shouldn't have, I'm sorry. Never single the state president out and say, never do that. Blake knows the answer to this, he's just setting me up.
inspector to be in that plant from 8 o'clock in the morning till 5 o'clock at night? Who pays for the inspector to be there after 5 o'clock? You don't. The plant does. So, I mean, could a guy not figure out some way to get around this problem and not say, oh my God, we got to shut the plants down and employ all the workers, unemploy all the workers, lay in furlough? You know, come on, guys. Now, as a talking point to scare the bejesus out of you, is that the talking point you want to use? Oh, heck yeah. But do you have to do it that way? Come on. You're a manager. Manage this problem. That's what we pay you for. You'll see Farm Service Agency. Here's Commodity Credit Corporation Fund. That's where you actually get, that's actually where the money comes from to pay your direct payment checks, to pay the counter-cyclical payments, to pay acre payments. That's where that money comes from. And yes, it's going to take a whack, 7.6%, $469 million. And if we do actually pay the direct payment checks, which I have every expectation that we're going to do that for the 2013 crop, they will be whacked by 7.6%. So whatever you got last year, it's going to be smaller by 7.6%. I'll tell you that right now. And yes, you've heard this bit about how we've gone through, laid out the details for every state about how evil these sequesters would be. Here's the points for Missouri. We're going to talk about losing $11.9 million and have the potential to put 160 teachers and age jobs at risk. You know, here's the number. Here's what the fact sheets say. And yes, you will probably lose in the state of Missouri about $12 million in federal funding for education. That's a problem for, you know, the state administrator of, you know, education administrator to figure out how he or she is going to deal. I apologize, I don't know who it is, but for them to have to deal with it. They're managers. Manage the problem. Et cetera, et cetera. Work study. Around 1,300 fewer low-income students in Missouri would receive aid, would receive work study jobs. Okay. You know, things happen. Head Start, you know, could be eliminated for approximately 1,200 children. Could be, could not be. Could decide how the state itself decides it wants to actually implement and manage those cuts and manage the reductions. And again, you know, could lose $3 million for environmental funding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Here's one that, you know, there's just not a whole heck of a lot else those guys can do because it kind of almost has to come down to salary dollars in order to generate that $40 million that we're talking about out of defense spending in the state of Missouri. And still, vaccines for children. This is the big one that you're hearing a lot of noise about. Oh my God, we're not going to be able to provide these vaccines to kids. You know, 2,500 fewer kids, $171,000. There's going to be more hue and angst over that $171,000. And more public noise about that number. Again, it's a management problem. Manage it. You know, figure out ways. You tell me in the entire budget that the state has for vaccines, we can't do some shuffling around to figure out ways to deal with that problem. Okay. So how are we going to fix it? Well, Senate Democrats have put a balanced plan on the table. Balance between revenue and spending cuts. And we're going to talk about raising $55 million, most of that money of which will come from the Buffett rule, that by gosh, we're going to boost the tax rates on folks that make more than $1 million. We're going to make sure that they pay at least 30% of their revenue in taxes. We're going to change the way that we tax treatment on oil from oil sands. We're also going to talk about ending tax breaks and to incentivize companies to move jobs overseas. On the spending side, we're going to take $27.5 billion out of defense, and we're going to take basically all of the domestic spending cuts by eliminating direct payments, and we're going to extend some other programs. We'll spend a little bit of it back So we're going to take basically all the domestic spending cuts in the Democrats' plans fall on agriculture. All. There you go.
Direct payments are $5 billion and they're at 27.
Well, they're going to get a little bit of it back because they're going to extend some of the programs. They won't tell us yet what programs are going to extend.
That's a 10-year fee.
That's a 9-year figure. It is. Don't forget that we're going to pay. Yes, you would say over that 10 years, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. You will say over that 10-year period that yes, it ought to amount to about $50 billion or so in direct payments, but it's only 9 years, so it's only $45 billion because we're going to pay this year's money. So $45 billion, and then we're going to extend some of the other programs that were part of that package. Now, you know what? I don't want there to be any misperception. The way you the mathematical formula for defining GDP is personal consumption expenditures, the money that you spend on stuff, on goods and services. You know, what you pay for, you know, your house, all that kind of good stuff. What the fixed business investment, you know, companies that go out and buy software, that buy new computers, that, you know, that kind of stuff, changes in inventories. The other big category is net exports. And the fourth category is government consumption expenditures. And so if you whack government consumption expenditures, even by $80 billion a year, there will be a temporary drag on the general economy. So here's what Congressional Budget Office thinks would happen if we talked about a $2 trillion increase in primary deficits. But in the short term, we get an uptick. Anything on the north of the zero line is an uptick. We get an improvement in the general economy in the short term. But over the longer term, 2018, 2020, et cetera, over the longer term, the economy would end up dragging itself down. It would not perform as well as it would without. If you had a $2 trillion reduction in primary deficits, yes, you're going to get a downturn in the first couple years, but by the time you're 5 years down the road, the economy is back to where it would have otherwise been, and in fact actually starts performing better. A $4 trillion reduction, you know, by a full 1.5% or so better. Are there short-term pain associated with that? Yes. Is there long-term gain? Yes. Where does that come from? It basically comes from what happens in the financial markets. You can't read those numbers, they're too small, I know that. In the short term, $2 trillion increase, interest rates would go up because the economy would perform just a little bit better. But in the longer term, those interest rates go up even more because the government's out there demanding more and more money. The government is remember, there's enough chronological experience in this room to remember the conversations we've had times past where we talked about crowding out. The government crowding out other folks that needed to borrow money. And that's exactly where this increase in interest rate comes from, as opposed to when the government gets out of those markets, doesn't need to borrow the money. Interest rates ends up being lower than they would otherwise be, and the economy is allowed to kind of grow and breathe. What happened when we were running a budget surplus? Remember how the economy was performing at that point in time? When we were running a budget surplus? Government wasn't buying money, didn't need to go out and borrow money. The markets could work. Markets could lend to business. We removed the invisible foot of government lending requirements, and we were able to move on from there. So where do we go from here? Anybody remember this? You know, I'm just a bill. There's some folks in this room who remember this. I'm only a bill. When do you think is the last time we actually did legislation this way? We haven't done legislation this way for years and years and years. You know, now we do legislation that we wait till the absolute last minute, we put 3 people in the room, and we say, find us an answer. Now, a guy that I know, Dan Cassidy knows well, that Garrett knows well, a guy by the name of Craig Jagger. spoke before the commodity roundtable not too long ago, a couple months or so ago. He was a former chief economist for the House Agriculture Committee. Craig made a I thought, very cogent statement. Craig says, you know, when legislation happens under regular order, there's a tremendous value on expertise, on figuring out what the unintended consequences are going to be, on figuring out how Program X is going to relate to Program Y. There's tremendous value on expertise. When you do it with 3 guys in the room with the door closed, expertise don't matter. And that's exactly the way we've been writing legislation for the last several years. So you can't read this because of the coloring and everything else, but this is regular order for the budget. And just so that you get a handle on how this happens. I can't even read it myself. So this is all basically the president writing his budget and submitting his budget to Congress. And it goes to both the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee. And they come up with their own budget resolutions. And they send their resolutions and it gets resolved between the House and Senate Ag Committee. It goes to the House floor, it goes to the Senate floor. They come up with their own agreements of what those budget resolutions ought to be. The House and Senate Budget Committees come together. They conference the difference between those two. It comes back out to the House and Senate floor, and a budget resolution for the entire Congress is agreed to. Instructions are sent in to the appropriators as well as to the authorizing committees to tell them what programs they need to cut, how much money the appropriations committees have to spend. They go do their job. They conference, things happen, and at the end of the day, but all the spending ends up then going to the president's desk for him to sign off on. And if you thought this was complicated, here are actually timelines associated with that as well. So by April, the House and Senate Budget Committees are supposed to come up with their own budget. And if you'll recall, we passed this last fiscal cliff deal. We basically said the House and the Senate Budget Committees will come up with their own budgets and will pass them by April 15th, or on April 16th, we will stop paying members of the House and Senate. Now, if you believe that's going to happen. But that's what we said. And that's how the process is supposed to work. You're getting lots of conversation in Washington to say we need to go back to regular order. We need to go back to the way things are supposed to work. Committees are supposed to work. That's where these debates and discussions and conversations and all these the challenges and the complications associated with this legislation needs to be worked out. We need to go back to regular order. I think we're going to do that, at least to start. So when somebody comes to me and says, well, when are we going to write a farm bill? I really don't think we're going to even start on a farm bill until the House and the Senate Budget Committees come up with their own respective budgets. Now, we have different numbers out of the House and different numbers out of the Senate? Yeah, probably so. Will you have clear direction on how you're supposed to proceed? Oh, hell no. But I do think they're going to act like they're going to be in regular order. And until they know what the number is that they have to go hit, they'd be foolish to go off and get started on the process anyway. So as I say, the Farm Bill process at this stage of the game is intimately linked to what's going to go on in the budget and this whole sequester and continuing resolutions and how we're going to fund the government for the rest of the year and everything else before we were able to make any further movement. I would remind you, now remember, the proposal that the Senate Democrats have put up to avoid the sequester takes all that direct payment money, spends a little bit of it back on some of the programs that don't have any funding for it, and that's with the expiration of the last farm bill. They won't tell us yet what those provisions are, but they're going to have to tell us by tomorrow, because they're supposed to be voting on it by tomorrow. So, to just remind ourselves, the Senate Ag Committee, as an example, took the $53 billion, $53.5 billion from commodity and crop insurance spending, and they spent $38.6 billion of that on ACR, on SCO, on other provisions, on new provisions in the Farm Bill. Now, if that money's gone, because we've used it to offset a sequester, sorry. You know, what money are you going to use to go off and write, you know, ACR or SCO? What kind of target prices, changes in target prices would you be able to pull out of this if that money's gone? Bottom line response to that is, you can never do anything with this. So how we roll through this, and that's again why I don't think either the House or the Senate Ag Committees can move on the Farm Bill until they know what the number is. Because if they don't have money, they don't have money. I should have said, I probably ought to say something about dairy. I think dairy, I know I got some dairy guys in the room, but I talked to them yesterday afternoon. You know, and we talked about this a little bit in the room the other day, or yesterday, that the supply management provisions of the, both the House and the Senate dairy titles cause Senate or Congressman or Speaker Boehner some tremendous concern and has real problems with those supply management provisions. Some will make the case that that's one of the whole reasons why the Farm Bill was not allowed to come to the House floor. And there's probably some validity to that assertion. I'd also say that National Milk has absolutely no will to talk about any dairy policy that would not include supply management provisions, so I'm not sure how we get from here to there at the end of the day. I want to close with this slide. Again, I stole this, plagiarized this from the Congressional Budget Office. 2 lines over here. This is our spending line today, projected spending line. This is our projected revenue line, percentage of GDP. They're projecting that we're going to get even as we move through the fiscal cliff. We're going to talk about revenues getting back up to about 18% or so of GDP. We're going to talk about spending on this up half, getting north of 25, 26, 7% of GDP as we move forward. If you want to bring the debt so that the debt as a percent of GDP is flat, constant percentage, I'm not talking about paying down debt, I'm just talking about debt to GDP going flat. You have to drop, surprise, and do it all with spending cuts. Surprise, you got to get, spending down to where it's only 20% of GDP. Surprise. So there's, by the time you're out to 2030 or so, there's a gap of almost 5% of GDP. That's a huge reduction. You want to do it on the revenue side. Surprise. You're going to have to go from 18% to 23% to north of, whatever. Answers at the end of the day is probably some combination of the two. How much of one, how much of the other? I don't know, but I sure as hell hope it's a heck of a lot more spending cuts than it is on the revenue side. When we start talking about, this percentage of GDP and taxes, and that's fun. Never even blew it up for you, so you see. I'll stop. Play questions will close my head. Well, Kelly, you yank me off and sit down. Yes, sir.
I have a question in regards to,
Here comes the microphone. Pause just for a moment so the rest of the room can hear your question.
I have the question is, what about these numbers must be in regards that we are still at a 7.8 unemployment plus. I mean, I don't see any influx of people getting jobs in that on these numbers. That has a big play on the income of money to our government.
Actually wrong. There's actually a very substantial decline in unemployment in CBO's projections. They actually have us getting back down to about a 5.5% unemployment rate by about 2017 or so.
Through the private sector.
Through the private sector. Well, all sectors, but primarily through the private sector.
I mean, the government sector does not really lower our...
Does not grow much at all.
No.
Certainly the federal level, government does not grow much at all. State and local government, which is where the vast majority of government employees are, would be a little bit different story.
I didn't hear any mention how that was going to be done. But, so far, we have not, in the last 5 years, we have had a decrease in our numbers, very little.
No argument there.
But the decline that we had, for example, when we had the mandatory spending, other than Medicare, Medicaid, other than those other provisions, that decline we had in mandatory spending, a big chunk of that was SNAP benefits. You know, folks did need to take a claim on SNAP benefits, and the reason for that was because they were going back to work.
And 47% of the people getting free money right now, how's that look?
It would go down. Projection would be that it would go down. Any other questions? I got one over here in the middle.
Does Obamacare help the health situation?
Hang on just 1 second. It'll be just-
Does Obamacare help the health costs at all, or is that just a joke?
I'm going to give you a very detailed response to this. You think I was giving you more? No, it just, it doesn't really make it right. You shuffle some money around, but at the end of the day, no, it doesn't. And again, think about the way, and you've heard me have this conversation with you before, think about the way that we handle healthcare costs today in this country. You walk in, you need it done, we're going to take care of the bill. Really. I'm going to really get right down to it. We'll argue over how much we're going to pay, we're going to argue over co-pays, that kind of stuff, and how much Medicare is going to cover the co-pays. We'll already have those arguments, but at the end of the day, you're going to get it done. And so you spend whatever you have to spend to cover that cost. We don't answer the question, when does your responsibility as a taxpayer for my health care costs stop? And if you're going to say that, then again, at some point in time, you have to say, we have to talk about either one of two things. We either have to say, here's a voucher, go buy your own insurance, or we say, we're going to have, this is the guy that's going to head up the debt committees. It says at what point in time we're going to stop, we're not going to do these services. 90-year-old lady comes in. A 90-year-old individual comes in and says, I need a new hip. Okay. If it's my wife, we're going to give her the new hip. If it's me, she'd say, you don't need that. Tough it out, man. And Blake's better. He knows. Yes, sir.
Mr. Young, you earlier on in your presentation, you had a slide that showed the amount of our budget will be just allocated towards servicing the interest on the debt. And certainly right now we kind of have free money, 2% interest rates or lower. And does that take into account that, 10 years from now we may have double-digit interest rates, and then God help us at that point. What are we going to do then?
That does make the assumption that we end up with, kind of an average rate that the government pays on debt ends up north of about 5% or so, which by, historical standards wouldn't be really high. Be a heck of a lot higher than what you're paying today, but it wouldn't be really high.
But if we had interest rates like we did in the 1980s,
That's a whole nother story.
with 18, 16%.
That's a whole nother story. And we could have a lengthy conversation about the Fed, but let's do that offline or whatever. Play it off. I'll stop whenever you want me to stop.
Any more questions? We can take one more, Kelly. We did a good job.
That's it.
All right. Good question. All right, here it is. This will be hard.
Yeah, this will be hard.
Well, I was just going to ask, when you think back the last couple of years, Congressman Ryan.
Wait just a second. It gives me time to figure out how I'm going to.
Okay, what was it, 2 years ago that Congressman Ryan introduced his path to prosperity, and people just absolutely decried him, crucified him for what? Balancing the budget over 20 years, I think, and he's projected to put out a plan to balance the budget in 10 years. What can we expect to be, any ideas as to what may be in his proposal this time?
I don't know. I've not been privy to those conversations, but you just kind of, you've seen the numbers as well as I have. First off, I doubt that he's going to put any more revenues on the table. Surprise, surprise. So, when you kind of think through it, my strong expectation is he's going to put that
voucher proposal back on the table again. And if I were him, that's probably what that you kind of have to do that. The numbers are so big otherwise, there's nothing left for what, again, we all kind of typically think of as government. So I think he does that. Farm programs, I think, get, whacked tremendously. I would not be at all surprised to see him come back and talk about lowering the premium subsidy amounts, for example. I won't be surprised to see that conversation come up. And on and on and on. Just that kind of whole litany of other program cuts that he had in the bill in his proposal before. You'll see all that come back up. Block grant, food stamp benefits, for as an example. Just on and on and on. Just all that stuff. Somebody's got to kind of start. We need to have that conversation here pretty soon.